Well, hey, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to speak today. And thanks to the entire AFWERX Fusion team and the Tyndall Program Management team for your work to make this event happen. It's a real honor to be here virtually with you all today, representing the Department of Air Force to discuss our lessons learned from Hurricane Michael and our efforts to improve installation resiliency for our 173 installations worldwide and over 1,700 sites worldwide. As many of you heard me say before, the Air Force fights from our bases. Therefore, the readiness and resiliency of our installations is a matter of strategic importance to our nation. The Air Force has well-established and effective incident management systems that unifies Air Force programs with interagency, state, and local communities. Installations routinely exercise their installation emergency management plans to ensure that they're prepared to face any threat. And this was demonstrated at Tyndall Air Force Base, where in a span of 2 days, the Hurricane Michael grew from a Category 2 hurricane with no sights on the installation to a Category 5 barreling directly toward the base. And due to their preparedness and effective implementation of their emergency management plans, Tyndall Air Force Base successfully evacuated all mission-capable aircraft, military members, and their families in less than 48 hours. The result? No loss of life and no loss of aircraft. So what can we learn from all of this? The Air Force has invested significant effort to assess, study, and share lessons learned from Hurricane Michael for the benefit of all of our installations. Last year, the Air Force completed a severe weather readiness assessment, which looked at severe weather in the same manner that we look at all threats to our mission. We also published a document called, coincidentally, Air Force Lessons Learned from Hurricane Michael. These assessment teams took a threat-based, readiness-centric approach to analyze how we are postured to respond and recover from severe weather events. These assessments resulted in well over 100 enterprise-wide recommendations to improve our readiness and resiliency. And while we certainly don't have time today to go very deep into either one of these publications, I just want to hit a few highlights and just acknowledge the great work by the team of teams who made these documents possible. So the doctrine in which we combat severe weather and combat severe weather threats is really no different than how we would combat a conventional adversary. We have to understand the adversary through intelligence, indications, and warnings. And then based on what we see and know, we have to maneuver against it, and in this case, defend against it. Our most powerful tools to defend the base are extensive planning, exercises, posturing, and making risk-informed resourcing decisions before the storm that balance operations with these types of contingency plans. And through our assessments, we found that the U.S. Air Force Weather Enterprise was very effective in providing our commanders decision quality weather information. And recommendations here are generally centered around improving our formal relationships with NOAA and the National Weather Service, and continuing to the use of probability forecasts to support our operational commanders around the globe. This information helps commanders decide which threats require the most attention and guides follow-on actions based on predicted impacts to their mission. Now, in response to these indications and warnings, we must also have solid hurricane readiness plans in place that include annual exercises which fully stress emergency management, continuity of operations, hurricane evacuation drills, primary, alternate, and emergency communications platforms, and sheltering plans. All of this are absolutely vital to our success. These plans must be logistics informed, with contingency stocks either on hand or with assured supply chains intact to ensure that the evacuation of personnel and aircraft, to ensure the evacuation of personnel and aircraft and to sustain contingency operations beyond that. Critical personnel and equipment should be identified as part of the ride-out teams so that immediate security and response actions are functioning once the storm passes. And finally, processes to support military and civilian personnel who are required to evacuate must be well-defined and rehearsed at the base level. Our plans must also be risk-informed, and the risk mitigations in this case really have to happen well, before the storm season to ensure that our plans can be successful. And while most of this falls into the category of ensuring resilient infrastructure, there are also a couple key actions we can take during the higher risk seasons of the year to improve our readiness to respond to these threats. One of our key infrastructure findings was that we need to have dedicated protected, hardened emergency operations centers with redundant power and communications, which allow commanders and their teams to safely ride out the storm and perform the critical command and control functions necessary to fight the base. Our EOCs need to have connectivity with joint and interagency response networks to ensure that commanders have a common operating picture of what's going on outside the wire and can integrate into unified response efforts. We must also ensure continual access to and prevent the loss of key maintenance information system data and essential command and control data in order to effectively manage response and recovery. So in this case, hardened architecture forward combined with cloud-based data processing and backup storage is key to this. Equipment and aircraft dispersal needs to happen at a deliberate, well-defined decision points and on a timeline that still allows our airmen the opportunity to safeguard and evacuate their families. And as we move to protect our aircraft, critical equipment, and essential personnel, sheltering areas have to be designed and built to provide the protection needed. Now, not every facility has to be hardened, but we need to identify the critical few that do as part of our master planning efforts. These sheltering areas may not even be a building or facility at all. They may just be an area on the base that protects equipment from wind and debris. Inspections for existing infrastructure need to happen on a recurring 5-year basis as a minimum to ensure that we understand what the updated conditions of those facilities are to inform risk mitigation measures, infrastructure investment, and our contingency plans. We should not, in any case, be putting airmen, weapon systems, and critical equipment into buildings that do not have the structural integrity to protect it. Facility resilience degrades over time, clearly, and it especially degrades when adequate funding is not available to properly maintain these facilities. Also, missions and weapon systems change, and we need to update and revalidate our risk assessments as these missions and weapon systems change, because sometimes even a low probability presents an unacceptable risk. Components and cladding need to be inspected by licensed professional engineers. We saw the snow globe effect, so to speak, inside of several of our facilities because the components and cladding was damaged or unserviceable from previous storms or just plain lack of maintenance. This created weak spots in the building envelope that progressed to more extensive damage. And along these same lines, sunshades also received special attention in our reviews. Sunshades are not shelters and present a high risk during high wind events to aircraft, personnel, and equipment as they become a significant source of flying debris. Also, our facility design requirements need to ensure that we're using water, mold, and mildew resistant materials for facility floors and walls. Additionally, design criteria should also account for the placement of mechanical and electrical equipment in a survivable area based on the most prominent threat for each region. And one recommendation that we've already implemented with regard to facility design standards was to establish a new design flood elevation at Tyndall Air Force Base. We're also incorporating the best practices in Florida's high velocity hurricane zone for new wind resilient construction. Hurricane Michael reinforced for us that life cycle asset management, proactive maintenance procedures, and a well-resourced infrastructure investment strategy are absolutely critical to our installations to ensure that they're fully prepared to face a full spectrum of threats. And to this end, the Air Force Infrastructure Investment Strategy, which was approved last year, sets the stage for stable installation funding and allows us to proactively invest at the lowest cost point in a facility's life cycle, and therefore freeing up essential funds to address the backlog of other maintenance work. The Infrastructure Investment Strategy provides a feasible remedy to restore the resiliency of our infrastructure at all of our bases and reduce the risk of damage from storms like Hurricane Michael. In addition to infrastructure readiness, other critical activities that we can take prior to the storm include ensuring our maintenance, facilities, utilities, privatized housing, and communications contractors are built into our planning, our posturing, our emergency response, and our recovery plans. Over the years, we've built robust relationships with the community and with our private sector partners, and we cannot do any of this without them. They have to be fully integrated. And with regard to family housing, we do need to look at new ways to improve the resilience for family housing through hardening measures, evacuation plans, and recovery procedures. Also, we need to conduct a catastrophic event financial stress test, if you will, with our project owners and their insurance companies to ensure that any potential issues with the claims process are resolved prior to filing a catastrophic claim. Our last focus area was recovery. Recovery planning is essential to preserve life and restore core mission capabilities as soon as possible. And delays after the storm with regard to recovery operations could exponentially increase damages, costs, and risk to our mission. Our recovery plans need to account for the critical capabilities needed immediately after the storm and implement actions which afford them the greatest chance of survival. Power and communications are the two most important capabilities overall to support operations and to reestablish the capabilities required to defend and open an airfield. Additionally, basic life support functions need to be in place as soon as possible to support our first responders. And we are better together. We need to continue increased integration with surrounding communities, private sector partners, and interagency teammates like FEMA, NOAA, and the National Weather Service during the recovery phase. This includes incorporating them into our plans and exercises, and vice versa. Hurricane Michael also demonstrated the great military value that our bases gain by, with, and through these types of mutually supporting relationships. You might ask yourself, why would we spend $3 billion to rebuild an Air Force base in a hurricane-prone area in the first place? It's because our airmen have immediate access to the airspace and ranges necessary to train and win our nation's wars. And the airspace and ranges around Tyndall Air Force Base are unique, and they are a national treasure. Air Force access to these ranges and airspace is not by accident. We only get it and maintain it through powerful partnerships with our federal, state, and local teammates and communities. So the huge amount of support that we receive from the Bay Area surrounding Tyndall Air Force Base is of intrinsic military value in and of itself. And frankly, in stark contrast to other locations where we operate, where it's extremely difficult for the Air Force to train the next generation of warfighters due to unchecked encroachment, increased land use restrictions, and a reticence for any type of modernization or expansion. And finally, we found that our military only succeeds when our units are led by committed, competent, empowered leaders of character. This is not something we can just turn on and off as our leaders rotate in and out of command. It only comes through years of experience, education, and professional development within a culture and ethic dedicated to creating the best leaders in the world. So kudos to the leadership at Tyndall Air Force Base and to all those leaders who stepped in to support them before and after the storm. We couldn't do any of this without you. To summarize, this isn't our first rodeo. We have taken significant action over the years to capture lessons learned, adapt, and improve our readiness based on lessons learned from previous severe weather events. An example of this is what we refer to as the Isabel Effect. In 2003, Hurricane Isabel hit Langley Air Force Base, resulting in $146 million in damage and a 4-day runway closure. Through targeted investments and updated preparation procedures, the Air Force significantly improved Langley's hurricane posture so that 11 years later, when Hurricane Irene hit the base with even greater force than Hurricane Isabel, it only caused $1.5 million in damage, with personnel able to reopen the runway in less than a day. Which brings me to the essence of why we're all here today. What should we be doing right now based on these lessons learned from Hurricane Michael to improve the resiliency to the types of weather threats that we see in this region? And that's where we're asking for your help, for your expertise, your experience, your good ideas, and your partnership. And while the installations portfolio will most certainly see constrained funding going into the future, we have a unique opportunity here with Tyndall Air Force Base and arguably Offutt Air Force Base, thanks to the tremendous support from the administration and Congress working together to provide the necessary funding to create the conditions for a future Hurricane Michael effect, so to speak. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you for your continued partnership, and thank you for your support for our air and space professionals.